Johnny Blake never wanted to be part of anyone's plans. After 37 years working maintenance and logistics in state facilities, he had learned the art of staying invisible, efficient, quiet, and forgotten, like the humming of old mechanical systems that just wouldn't die. When he finally retired, his only wish was to keep things simple. No HOA meetings, no neighborhood events, no small talk at mailboxes. Just him, his home, and the soft, reliable rhythm of water flowing from the old copper pipes his father had laid beneath the soil decades ago. His property sat on the outer edge of a quiet community that had slowly gentrified around him, where new residents arrived with glossy SUVs and color-coordinated trash bins and began fencing in invisible lines of control with their landscaping and community improvement committees. But Johnny didn't care about any of that. His land was his land, documented, squared, and surveyed. The water he used came from the deep aquifer his father tapped in 1978, a well drilled 30 feet deeper than modern systems, because the old man never trusted surface water, and neither did Johnny. That well, and the modest water system Johnny maintained himself, were the arteries of his life, quiet, clean, dependable. He checked the pressure once a week, cleaned the screen filters twice a month, flushed the lines every quarter like clockwork. There were no smart sensors, no Bluetooth monitors, just calibrated brass gauges, thick industrial pipes, and a man who knew their sounds better than he knew most people's voices. Nothing in that system ever failed without a warning, and that's why when the kitchen faucet began sputtering one morning like it had air in the line, Johnny knew immediately something was wrong. He walked out to the pump house behind the shed with his tools in hand, expecting to find a pressure valve in need of cleaning or perhaps a leak in the outflow pipe. But the gauges read fine. The tanks were at level. The flow regulator hadn't tripped. What caught his attention wasn't something mechanical. It was the physical water meter itself, the one just before the pipe entered his crawl space. It was different. The original meter had been an old Model 420 brass unit with a manual flow wheel and a rusted housing cover that hadn't latched properly since 2015. This one was plastic, new, with a barcode, and a manufacturer stamp that read MSTW3. Johnny stared at it for a full minute before kneeling down and confirming his suspicion. This was not his meter. Someone had removed the original and replaced it with a tamper-proof unit designed for remote reading. But no utility company had any business on his land, and he'd never authorized any change. He unscrewed the cap and looked closer. It was clean. Too clean. The seal around the fitting still smelled like industrial tape. This thing had been installed recently. Very recently. And not by anyone with a right to be there. It wasn't vandalism, no signs of damage. Whoever had done it knew exactly what they were doing. They had shut off the main, disconnected the line with care, swapped the units, and resealed it like a professional job. That was what unsettled Johnny the most. This wasn't a prank, and it wasn't random. It was targeted, intentional. Someone had entered his property, tampered with his infrastructure, and left behind a unit designed to interface with a broader monitoring system. But for what? Why? He didn't have internet-connected plumbing, no smart home devices, no utility accounts beyond electricity. Water was independent, always had been. He checked his pressure again. It was lower than normal, enough for a faucet to sputter, not enough to trip alarms. A slow draw. A siphon. He traced the line beneath the foundation, out to where it connected with his outflow junction near the rear edge of his property. That's where the land dropped slightly, where the runoff trenched down toward the neighbor's lot. And that neighbor, with the aggressively trimmed bushes and the plastic deer on the lawn, was Karen Miller. Karen had moved in 3 years ago after buying out the family that used to run a small nursery business on that parcel. From the moment she arrived, she made herself known. Door flyers about leaf blower hours, clipboard patrols for unauthorized fencing, and smiling conversations with threats baked in sugar. Karen didn't knock. She notified. She didn't ask. She informed. It wasn't that she hated Johnny. She simply ignored him. To her, he was a relic, an outdated homeowner, an exception she needed to convert. The fact that he never attended the monthly gatherings or contributed to the Clean Street Fund seemed to her like defiance. She never said it directly, but she'd hinted enough. "We like everyone to participate, Johnny. We all want to make the neighborhood better, Johnny." And when he kept his gates closed, she started making calls. First to zoning, then code enforcement, then the water board, none of whom found violations, but all of whom were suddenly aware that Johnny Blake had his own private well system, unaudited and self-maintained. So, when he followed the faint sound of trickling through the utility access trench that ran near the back fence and found a soft indentation in the soil, a freshly laid pipe leading under his boundary and toward Karen's decorative mulch bed, it didn't take him long to understand. She had tapped his line. Whether personally or through hired help, she had engineered a bypass that quietly fed her new underground irrigation tank. A tank installed 2 months ago for drought sustainability, as she had proudly announced in the neighborhood newsletter. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but now it made sense. The tank was never connected to municipal supply. It was too far back, too discreet. It needed pressure. His pressure. Johnny stood there a long time, staring at the shallow soil and the thin PVC line vanishing beneath the hedgerow, and something inside him shifted. Not anger. He'd felt that before. This was something colder. Karen had walked onto his land, compromised his infrastructure, stolen his resource, and smiled while doing it. She had calculated that he wouldn't respond, that he wouldn't know, that he was too old, too detached, too stubborn or stupid to notice. But Johnny Blake wasn't any of those things. He wasn't going to call the police and file a report that would sit on a desk for 6 weeks. He wasn't going to knock on her door and have a neighborly chat. And he sure as hell wasn't going to start a shouting match over property lines. He walked back inside, filled a thermos with coffee, pulled out the old spiral notebook he kept for system maintenance logs, and flipped to a fresh page. At the top, he wrote, "Unauthorized tap. Countermeasures." Then he drew a simple schematic of the line junction near the rear trench, added a secondary valve, and began calculating pressure thresholds for reverse flow. If Karen wanted to use his water, then maybe it was time she got a taste of what it felt like when that water turned on her instead. Johnny didn't make moves in haste. That was part of what made him different from the people who were trying to reshape the neighborhood around him. He didn't react with noise, didn't waste time chasing confrontation. Instead, he took the same measured approach he used to maintain water pressure and calibrate his pump switches. He responded with preparation. That evening, he opened up the back panel of his main flow control box and replaced the automatic valve driver with a manual bypass system. Not because he wanted to trap anyone, he wasn't playing games, but because he wanted full control. Every ounce of water that left his well would now be logged and accounted for. And if any left without permission, it wouldn't go unnoticed. But he needed more than physical control. He needed proof. Not assumptions, not gut feelings. Proof. The first step was technical. He opened his secure lockbox in the garage, an old reinforced filing cabinet that predated every modern safe, and removed a handheld flow reader, a clunky device the size of a shoebox, built in the late 90s but reliable as hell. Most people had never heard of it, but it still interfaced with analog pressure meters. He connected it to the line and set the timer. Then he waited. No water was being used in the house, no faucets open, no flushes, no washing machine. And still, the reading ticked upward. Not fast, just enough to show movement. A slow siphon. Unaccounted flow. Confirmed. Johnny disconnected the meter, locked it back in the cabinet, and sat down at the workbench with a pencil. The rate of flow wasn't heavy, which meant the line Karen had installed wasn't designed for high-demand appliances. It was irrigation. That made sense. A slow draw over hours to fill a reservoir. Low enough to fly under pressure alarms, low enough that most people wouldn't notice unless they were watching, But he had been watching. Now he needed to understand the scale of her setup. He returned to the back trench, staying outside the visible fence line, and followed the line visually along the slope of the land. The pipe disappeared under a rose garden that Karen had installed last spring, complete with stone borders and a little bench shaped like a butterfly. Behind it was her backyard, pristine, ornamental, always wet-looking no matter how dry the season. Johnny hadn't thought much of it before. A woman wants her garden green, so be it. But now, knowing what he knew, every wet leaf and damp walkway screamed of arrogance. The tank itself was buried, no doubt. She wouldn't leave it exposed. But he could see the control panel for her irrigation controller mounted behind the garage, wires leading underground. He didn't need to dig anything up. He just watched. Once a night, always after full dark, her system would kick on. You could hear the light chattering of valves and a faint hum as the pumps activated. She had pressure, and it wasn't hers. Johnny made a note of the time and checked it for 3 nights straight. It was always the same window. Her system ran for about an hour and a half, drawing quietly from a pipe she didn't own, from water she didn't pay for, from a source she had no right to touch. He could have stopped it then and there, closed the valve, killed the line, cemented it shut. But Johnny wasn't interested in just halting the theft. He needed to make it undeniable. He needed her to be the one to face what she had done. So he installed a one-way directional valve with a delayed response circuit and pressure regulator, a primitive, gravity-based design that would only activate under specific flow conditions. In short, it would allow water to flow out only when her system activated, but it wouldn't give her water. Instead, it would pull water back, redirect the suction to her own tank and dump it through the return trench he had carved decades ago, now hidden under the new mulch she probably never knew existed. She wouldn't notice at first. The tank would empty slowly. Her system would sputter. She'd blame the dry weather. Maybe call a technician. But they wouldn't find a leak. They'd find a drain. And if they traced it, it would lead right back to her own damn garden. He kept quiet. Karen, on the other hand, didn't. Within a few days, her behavior shifted. The cheerful waves across the lawn turned into stiff glares. She began walking her little dog up and down the block at odd hours, pausing in front of Johnny's house as if inspecting the siding or checking the mailbox for alignment. She left sticky notes on his gate, passive-aggressive nonsense about lawn maintenance schedules or garbage bin alignment. He didn't respond. That only seemed to provoke her more. A week later, he received a notice in his mailbox, not from the city, but from a local Community Standards Committee, a non-governmental body that claimed oversight for shared property aesthetics. They cited him for non-compliance with water usage protocols, a phrase so absurd Johnny had to read it twice. He looked up the return address. It wasn't official. It was a P.O. box tied to a neighborhood coordinator. The name on the letterhead? Karen Miller. That evening, Johnny took the letter, folded it neatly, and placed it in a manila envelope with a copy of the State Water Rights Code and a notarized copy of his grandfathered well certification, which clearly indicated private, non-utility supply, exempt from community regulation. He didn't mail it. He walked it to her doorstep, rang the bell, and when she answered, he didn't say a word, just handed it to her and walked away. No confrontation, no raised voice, just fact. Karen's face flushed. She held the envelope like it was a threat. Maybe to her it was. The next day, her contractor arrived. An unmarked van parked in front of her driveway, and 2 men in the high-vis vests began digging near the back fence. Johnny watched from his porch, sipping coffee. They weren't city workers, no logos, no badges, but they were professionals. They weren't fixing anything. They were installing something. By evening, he saw it. A new control box on her side of the fence, spliced into the same irrigation control system. Whatever her original tap had done, she was trying to rebuild it, this time with backup. Johnny walked the perimeter of his property the next morning and found 2 new PVC lines tunneling under the hedgerow. She wasn't just tapping his well again. She was doubling down. It was then Johnny decided that letting her fail quietly wasn't enough. He called a licensed hydrologist he'd worked with 10 years ago during a drought compliance inspection. A no-nonsense man named Tressler, with an eye for pipe irregularities and a deep distrust of home irrigation experts. Johnny didn't tell him what to find, just invited him for a site review and mentioned that he suspected unreported outflow discrepancies. Tressler arrived, ran his readings, and within 2 hours confirmed there was non-standard routing and volume variance inconsistent with declared usage. In short, water was disappearing. Johnny didn't accuse, he just documented. The report went to the county resource office, attached to a formal inquiry about unauthorized cross-property flow structures. No names were named, but they didn't have to be. The measurements spoke for themselves. Karen received her notice 2 days later. Johnny saw the envelope in her mailbox as he walked by, calm as ever, and for the first time, she didn't meet his eyes. But this wasn't over. Because later, that same night, someone entered Johnny's yard. No break-in, no damage, just one thing missing. The reverse flow control box he had installed had been unbolted and removed. Clean, precise, no footprints, no debris. Whoever did it knew plumbing and had gloves. But Johnny had known that might happen. So he had left the real one buried 2 feet below under a decoy housing. The one they took was a prop. Empty, non-functional, a message. And he had one too. He went back inside, took out his notebook, and wrote just 2 words. Let's continue. Johnny Blake had never been someone who invited conflict, but he also wasn't the kind of man who stepped aside once it came knocking. Karen might have believed her sabotage was surgical, precise, and invisible, but the only thing more predictable than her trespassing was her ego. People like her always doubled down when challenged, never believing someone quiet might actually be more prepared than the loud ones. She hadn't just tried to steal his water, she'd tried to erase his right to exist outside her circle of control. What she didn't realize was that Johnny had spent a lifetime learning how to fix things quietly, with tools no one else could handle, and patience most people would have mistaken for passivity. But this wasn't about fixing anymore. It was about preserving. Not just water, but principle. When the fake reverse flow device disappeared from its casing, Johnny took it as confirmation. She was either desperate or confident enough to think he wouldn't push back. Maybe both. That was her pattern. But he didn't react. He simply replaced the decoy with a new pressure relay system. This one embedded deeper in the line with no visible surface access, protected by dual valves and pressure switch encryption. A simple mechanism, but effective. It would register every outbound and inbound flow, log the timestamps on a physical dial he could read with his own eyes, and reset after each cycle. It required no electricity, no wireless signal, just physics, metal, and precision. Machines didn't lie. What changed next wasn't the system. It was the tone. Karen began escalating her campaign publicly. The notes on his gate weren't just passive-aggressive now, they were aggressive, period. One morning, he found a letter taped to his front door, not in an envelope, just laminated and printed in bold font, accusing him of threatening the environmental balance of the neighborhood by operating an unregulated high-output water system in violation of community stewardship principles. The irony almost made him laugh. She had siphoned his water, tampered with his infrastructure, and now had the gall to paint herself as a defender of the environment. It would have been funny if it wasn't so calculated. The next week brought an inspection notice, this time from the Environmental Oversight Volunteer Group, another shell committee Karen had either created or manipulated. They claimed they were conducting randomized inspections to assess the impact of personal systems on communal soil health and aquifer sustainability. Johnny didn't respond. Not immediately. Instead, he called the County Office of Private Utilities, verified his rights, recorded the call, and requested an official written reaffirmation of his exempt status, which had been on file for decades. Then he scanned it, printed multiple copies, and kept one in every room of his house, laminated. Karen could send her clipboard battalion as many times as she wanted, but they wouldn't find a door willing to open unless they had a judge's signature. When the inspection team arrived, 2 teenagers in matching polo shirts carrying generic tablets, Johnny met them at the edge of his driveway. He handed them the official exemption document, said nothing, and pointed toward the exit. They looked unsure whether to argue, then wisely chose to leave. Karen, watching from across the street, held her phone up as if recording. Johnny met her stare for the first time in weeks. She smiled. He didn't. That night, he rechecked his pressure logs. Something had changed again. The siphon was no longer a slow, subtle draw. It had increased. Not drastically, but enough that his system had registered a short-term dip below optimal pressure. His tank was still within acceptable limits, but that wasn't the point. The point was, she wasn't just stealing. She was draining, quickly, with more force, likely using a booster pump now, perhaps connected to a timer to avoid detection. It was reckless, dangerous, and entirely predictable. He could have sealed the line. He could have destroyed her access point permanently. But Johnny had a better idea. He set a manual purge system on his end, redirected the outbound flow through a secondary bypass valve, and sent the water through a gravel filtration trench that emptied directly into the gully running along the edge of her lot. Completely legal. Runoff, untraceable and harmless in appearance. But here was the twist. The flow rate matched her demand perfectly, only in reverse. Every time she activated her pump, it would engage his purge cycle and flood the trench behind her hydrangeas. The effect wouldn't be immediate, but over time, her carefully staged garden would become oversaturated, then sodden, then rotted from the roots. Not sabotage, just nature, nudged slightly in its course. 3 days later, Karen installed motion-activated lights along the fence line. Then came the surveillance cameras, cheap, solar-powered, cloud-based junk that beeped audibly when activated, as if they were warning signs rather than hidden eyes. Johnny didn't need to avoid them. He wasn't breaking any laws, but their presence made one thing clear. She was nervous. She had expected retaliation, and now she waited for it, day and night. But retaliation never came. Only water. Her water, returning to her in all the ways she had never asked for. Still, she didn't stop. She filed a complaint with the county registrar, alleging that Johnny had modified his property in ways that impacted community-shared ground stability. The phrase itself was meaningless, but the result was predictable. An inquiry, another letter, another knock on the door. This time, a young county assessor with a clipboard, professional, apologetic, but persistent. Johnny invited him to walk the property, on the condition that the conversation was recorded and the visit stayed within the legal bounds of the assessor's authority. The man agreed. They walked. Johnny explained the systems calmly, factually, showing the documented infrastructure, licensed installation records, and the family deed confirming historical land use exemptions. The assessor didn't find anything problematic. But before he left, he paused at the edge of the driveway and asked, quietly, not as a bureaucrat, but as a person, "Is it true what she's saying? That you've got something installed that redirects her irrigation?" Johnny looked him in the eye and replied, "She installed a line that crosses my boundary. She's been drawing from a source she doesn't own. I redirected nothing. I simply returned what was taken." The man nodded. "I thought so," he said. "Off the record, I've had other complaints about her. You're not the first. Probably won't be the last." Johnny didn't answer. He didn't need to. After the visit, Karen upped the pressure, literally. Her pump cycles increased in frequency. Johnny's sensors recorded high-volume pulls every 4 hours, regardless of weather. She was overwatering now, drenching the soil, oversaturating her tanks, running the pumps on cycles no responsible gardener would justify. But that wasn't the point anymore. This wasn't irrigation. This was power. She was asserting dominance over the very ground they both lived on, one valve, turn at a time. That weekend, Johnny's mailbox was destroyed. Not removed, not vandalized with spray paint. Destroyed. Bent backward, ripped from its foundation. The post cracked at the base like it had been hit with a crowbar or a sledgehammer. He didn't report it. He installed a new one that night, this time with a reinforced steel core and hidden plate anchors under the gravel. No message, no signs. Just presence. Karen didn't speak. She didn't have to. But the game had changed. She wasn't trying to win anymore. She was trying to provoke. It was the same playbook, over and over, escalate, accuse, create pressure until the other side folds. But Johnny Blake didn't fold. He recalibrated. The next morning, he sent a registered letter, not to Karen, but to the County Water Management Office, requesting formal documentation of any pending changes to water zoning boundaries in the area, specifically those tied to non-utility irrigation initiatives. The response, when it came a week later, included a map. That map showed that Karen had submitted a request to have Johnny's parcel evaluated for future community water integration, a bureaucratic euphemism for forced connection to the municipal line. The justification: unmonitored private consumption affecting groundwater equilibrium. She wasn't just stealing his water, she was trying to eliminate his independence altogether. Johnny scanned the letter, annotated it with dates and public records, then submitted a formal rebuttal, complete with his hydrologist's report, land use history, and well-depth analysis. The documentation was irrefutable. But that wasn't the win. The win came when the county clerk attached a note to the final page, in handwriting, that read, "Off record. This isn't the first time she's tried this. You're covered. But stay sharp." Johnny folded the note, placed it in his notebook, and checked his flow register. Pressure normal. Intake steady. Return flow optimal. He didn't need to speak to Karen again, because the system was already doing all the talking. Johnny Blake had always believed that the heart of any conflict wasn't the argument itself, but the pressure beneath it. The pressure to yield, to compromise what was yours because someone louder said it wasn't. That was what Karen misunderstood. She mistook silence for surrender, patience for absence, and stoicism for weakness. But Johnny was done being silent. He hadn't just protected his system, he had fortified it. And now, with every passing day, the line between what was hers and what wasn't had become more than symbolic. It had become a question of resource, regulation, and survival. The system he built in response to Karen's theft wasn't simply a reaction. It was a statement, a structural resistance against a person whose thirst for control had outgrown reason. And yet, the more he fortified, the more aggressively she acted, escalating beyond water, beyond boundary lines, into the realm of calculated attrition. Still, Johnny didn't retaliate emotionally. He took each new move from her like an engineer reads a stress fracture, an indication of how much more weight the system could carry before it failed. It began subtly, as most things did in these battles. Karen shifted tactics. If she couldn't outmaneuver him legally, and if her attempts to smear him with pseudo-authority had failed, she would now cloak her actions under the veil of bureaucratic civility. He received a letter, not hostile, but cold, legal in tone, issued by a private attorney representing what was described as a neighborhood preservation initiative. The content of the letter was an invitation, on its surface, a request to discuss a potential voluntary integration of private systems into a regional resource-sharing model. But Johnny knew better. Voluntary in print meant pressured in practice. The attached proposal outlined a model in which legacy properties, like his, would agree to cede partial water rights to a shared community cooperative. The stated goal was equitable resource distribution. The actual result would be forfeiture of control. He read the letter twice, then ran a background check on the firm. It was small, local, and recently incorporated. The attorney listed was real, but had no history in utility law. The client listed in the filing was Karen Miller. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he contacted a former colleague, a retired compliance auditor named Chambers, who had spent 20 years exposing municipal overreach in small-town councils. Johnny didn't ask for representation. He asked for analysis. Within 2 days, Chambers returned with a full report. The proposal wasn't illegal, but it was riddled with redirection. Buried in the 5th clause was a rider that would have granted Karen's initiative the right to inspect and modify participant systems for maximum efficiency, which in real terms meant installation of override valves, flow regulators, and remote access panels. Had Johnny signed, she could have controlled his system from a touchscreen. The sheer audacity of the attempt was staggering. He printed the full report, labeled it, and filed it in the same drawer where he kept his deed and his father's original well permit. But this time, Johnny didn't wait. He knew that Karen's next step wouldn't be legal. It would be strategic, and she didn't disappoint. 2 days later, while inspecting the south trench for erosion, Johnny noticed movement in the soil near the hydrangea line. The trench had shifted. Not much, but enough to suggest tampering. He ran a camera snake through the bypass channel and saw it immediately. A second inlet, crudely spliced, leading directly into a flex pipe headed back toward Karen's garden. This wasn't a siphon. This was theft with an engineered redundancy. If one tap was discovered, another would carry the load. It wasn't a gardener's trick. It was infrastructural fraud. That same night, Johnny drafted a formal report to the county Soil and Water Division, complete with photos, timestamps, and fluid path analysis. The filing was dry, clinical, but loaded. Within 48 hours, he received confirmation that the case had been escalated for review. Karen responded the only way someone like her knew how: deflection through spectacle. She hosted a community gathering in her backyard, complete with banners about sustainability, printed brochures with bar graphs, and a smiling local councilman who probably thought he was attending a garden party. Johnny watched from a distance, unnoticed, as Karen played hostess to a parade of well-meaning neighbors, many of whom had no idea they were walking into a manufactured narrative. She gave speeches about conservation, displayed charts about water scarcity, and even held up a framed certificate from a self-funded environmental group listing her as a model eco-steward. The irony was breathtaking. The woman, stealing water from beneath someone else's feet, had now crowned herself protector of the land. That night, Johnny wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He felt something deeper, something quieter. A hollow recognition that some people would rather rewrite reality than admit wrongdoing. And as he sat alone in his workshop, surrounded by the groan of pipes and the scent of machine oil, he understood something essential. This wasn't just about his water system anymore. It was about whether someone could lie enough times, loudly enough, and convince a room full of people that they were the ones being wronged. The next morning, the County Water Division inspector arrived unannounced. A woman in her 40s, professional, courteous, no visible affiliation with any local politics. Johnny respected that. He walked her through the entire system, step by step, explaining his maintenance routines, showing his permits, and presenting a full schematic of the original well line and the newer defensive valves he'd installed only after unauthorized flow had been detected. She took notes, asked sharp questions, measured pressure at both junctions, and thanked him for his cooperation. Then, without prompting, she crossed the street to Karen's property. What happened there, Johnny couldn't see. But by the end of the hour, the inspector returned, her clipboard fuller, her eyes more certain. She said nothing more than, "We'll be in touch," and drove off. Johnny didn't follow up. He didn't need to. The process had started. The fallout didn't come in an explosion. It came in drops. Karen's lawn began to brown. Her hydrangeas wilted. Sprinkler heads sputtered. The lush green that once painted her property like a magazine spread began to dry, curl, and peel back. Johnny hadn't touched her land. He hadn't disabled her pump. He had simply protected what was his and trusted gravity to do the rest. Without a line to siphon from, her tank couldn't fill. Without filling, her system failed. Without water, her facade cracked. Still, she fought. She claimed drought. She blamed faulty timers. She hosted another gathering, but this time, fewer people came. The councilman didn't return, and the banner, once proud and taut, now sagged in the summer heat. Johnny didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. The real victory wasn't in her withering lawn. It was in the system he had built, one of checks, balances, and principled defiance. Then came the envelope. Thin, official, marked with a county seal. Inside was the report: unauthorized cross-property extraction infrastructure confirmed. Cease and desist order issued. Penalty pending. Karen had been caught, not by retaliation, not by sabotage, but by law, by evidence, by the very system she tried to manipulate. And with it came a second letter. This one from the Office of Residential Land Services confirming that Johnny's property rights had been reaffirmed and that no future petitions regarding communal integration could be filed without his direct consent. He pinned both letters to the inside wall of his shed, above the control panel where they'd remain, not as trophies, but as reminders. The midpoint had been passed. The battle was no longer theoretical. It was documented, codified, real, and as Johnny turned the valve to test the pressure one final time, feeling the steady surge of clean, unmolested water rush through the line, he smiled, not because he'd won, but because he hadn't backed down. The mistake most people make when they lose is assuming the game is over. But Karen Miller wasn't most people. She was the kind who doubled down in failure, mistaking stubbornness for strength, believing that if she could no longer win by pretending to be right, she could still wear you down until you regretted being right at all. After the county issued its cease and desist order, most would have retreated, regrouped, and accepted the cost of being caught. But not Karen. Her yard might have turned to pale gold under the weight of her own overwatering, her irrigation tank now dry and inert, but her will to interfere had only hardened. She stopped trying to control the narrative in public and began working in quiet, disruptive increments, turning away from spectacle and toward disruption. Johnny noticed it first, not in the pressure gauge or in the soil near his fence line, but in the faces of his neighbors, people he'd once greeted with nods or the rare exchange of weather complaints now passed him with tight lips, stifled hellos, and the uneasy posture of those coached to avoid controversy. He hadn't spoken about the cease and desist order to anyone. He hadn't posted it or waved it around, but Karen had. Not the truth, of course, just her version of it. Word spread quickly that Johnny had targeted her with a legal ambush, that he'd refused to cooperate with an effort to improve the neighborhood's infrastructure, and that his well was unsafe, unmonitored, and potentially contaminating. It was classic projection. Accuse the other of exactly what you've done yourself and do it loudly enough that the facts become background noise. Johnny didn't respond. Not to the looks, not to the whispers, not even to the woman who crossed the street just to avoid walking her dog past his driveway. But he did notice, and he filed each observation away, not out of paranoia, but because experience had taught him that when liars lose reach, they reach deeper. Then came the contractor trucks. At first, it was one. A flatbed hauling what looked like landscaping material, pulling into Karen's driveway just after sunrise. Then another, and another. Over the course of a single weekend, her backyard became a work zone. Loud, muddy, and enclosed with temporary fencing. She told anyone who asked that she was rebuilding the drainage system, that recent flooding had destabilized the south bed. But Johnny knew better. He watched the delivery manifests taped to the contractor's toolboxes. Subsurface PVC, programmable timers, concrete anchor rods. Not drainage, control, not repair, rebuilding. She was building something she no longer had the right to, and she was doing it under the veil of plausible necessity. He took photos discreetly from inside his workshop through a reinforced pane, high enough resolution to catch model numbers and installation diagrams when careless hands held them out in the sun. He cross-checked them online. A closed-loop system, non-permitted, designed for private routing. She was trying to install a secondary network of hidden lines, one that, if placed properly, could attempt to skirt the inspection points marked in the county's enforcement records. It wouldn't work, not legally, but it could function long enough to force another confrontation, another cycle, another hearing. The problem with legal victories is they only last until the next claim is filed. And Karen filed one. This time it came in the form of an environmental safety petition, a formal request to the county to conduct a follow-up inspection of Johnny's well system on the grounds of potential backflow contamination due to structural decay. It was a strategic escalation. By claiming safety, she bypassed procedural delays. The county had to respond within a fixed window, and if they didn't clear him in time, he could be subjected to a precautionary shutoff. It was a move of pure spite. No evidence, no basis, just the slow grind of process being weaponized. But Johnny wasn't caught off guard. The week before, anticipating her next move, he had already contacted a certified groundwater technician to conduct a full integrity check of his system, including material condition, outflow readings, and microbial analysis. The report came back clean, literally and legally. He had documented proof of operational safety, signed off by a third-party specialist unaffiliated with the county or the neighborhood. When the county inspector arrived, this time with 2 observers, Johnny handed over the report, stood back, and said nothing more than, "Take all the time you need." They did. They photographed everything, verified flow and backflow, confirmed that no water was escaping the system or leaching into shared soil. When they left, one of them thanked him under his breath, not out of sympathy, but out of embarrassment. It was the 3rd time his property had been checked, the 3rd time no fault had been found, and yet the paperwork kept coming. Karen, meanwhile, accelerated her construction. Her contractors weren't just working during the day now. They started appearing after dusk, their headlamps flickering through the temporary tarps she'd erected to block visibility. Johnny didn't approach. He didn't call the police. Instead, he contacted the Municipal Line Marking Service and requested a property line validation survey under the pre-excavation statute. It was public service, free of charge, and required before any deep digging. 3 days later, the surveyors arrived and flagged her yard in bright orange paint, identifying exactly where the legal property line began and ended. The next morning, 2 of the markers had been pulled up and thrown in Johnny's side lot. He took a photo and emailed it to the survey office. By the end of the week, Karen received a violation notice for unpermitted subterranean development and unauthorized obstruction of municipal survey markings. The work stopped, but only temporarily. She paid the fine, quietly, promptly, and filed a counter-complaint, this time alleging that Johnny's workshop, situated near the east boundary, exceeded zoning limits for personal utility structures. It was a transparent deflection, but it triggered another review, another delay, another inch of ground in a war waged through paperwork. Johnny submitted his original permits. The workshop had been built 22 years ago, grandfathered in under prior zoning law. It met all modern requirements and exceeded several. The county closed the file within 72 hours, but the message had been sent. She wasn't going to stop, not because she was right, but because she couldn't afford to be wrong. That was when the dead patch appeared in Johnny's lawn. A perfect circle, 3 feet wide. No insects, no mold. Just scorched earth. Not natural, not accidental. The kind of thing that happens when someone pours the wrong kind of chemical near the root base under cover of darkness. He didn't have cameras on that side of the house. Never needed them before. But now, as he stared at the discolored soil, he realized this had gone beyond theft, beyond sabotage, into something pettier, something cowardly. He filed a report, not with the police, with his insurance provider. Damage from external contaminant, suspected source unknown. They documented it, took samples, and began their own investigation. Johnny, meanwhile, installed perimeter lighting. Subtle, infrared triggered, and connected to a closed-circuit recorder hidden inside the workshop wall. He didn't announce it. He didn't mention it. He simply watched. The first night, nothing. The second, wind and raccoons. The third, a figure. Not Karen, not her husband. A teenager, masked, cautious, moving along the side fence and pausing just long enough to hold something above the grass. A bottle. Then retreat. Johnny didn't react. He waited for the insurance report to confirm what he already suspected. Herbicide. Industrial strength. Poured undiluted. Banned for residential use. He submitted the footage and his provider contacted law enforcement, not for prosecution, but for escalation. If it happened again, they said, it would become a matter of criminal trespass. Karen didn't retaliate with another stunt. She did something worse. She disappeared. No yard work, no walks, no visible presence. Just silence. Her lawn grew wild. Her sprinklers stayed off. The construction tarps were rolled up, the tools gone. She stopped trying to bury him in letters and noise. She didn't need to. The silence did the work now. An oppressive quiet that made the neighborhood lean toward him, not away. They didn't say anything, but their glances softened. One neighbor even nodded again. And Johnny. He didn't claim victory. He just watered his lawn. From his own well. On his own time, with his own hands. Because sometimes the only way to win a war of attrition is not to fire the last shot, but to outlast every bullet. There was a particular stillness that settled over a place after too much had happened and too little had been resolved. A tension that no longer vibrated, but compressed, packed deep like pressure in a sealed pipe waiting for the wrong valve to turn. That was the air Johnny breathed now. Not relief, not victory, just density. Karen's silence hadn't brought closure, only an eerie sense of pause, the way a storm sometimes withdraws just far enough to make you doubt it ever happened before circling back to finish what it started. Her lawn stayed dry, her blinds remained shut, and the contractors who once swarmed her backyard never returned. There were no more letters, no more accusations, no more attempts at public shaming. But Johnny wasn't fooled. Absence was never absence with people like Karen. It was plotting in a quieter room. When the letter arrived, it didn't come from her directly. It came from the office of a private civil mediator, stamped and folded with clinical precision, its language detached, professional, but not impartial. It invited Johnny to participate in a conflict resolution session, to address disputes relating to private property infrastructure boundaries and community impact. It was signed by the mediator, but the request originated from Karen Miller. The implication was clear. She wanted one last arena, one last controlled environment where she could frame the narrative without the burden of county inspectors or legal codes. Johnny read the letter 3 times, placed it on his workbench, and didn't touch it again until the night before the scheduled meeting. He didn't prepare a speech. He didn't gather documents. He just printed one photograph. The still image from his infrared camera, showing a masked teenager on his property holding a chemical bottle above his soil. He slid the print into a folder and left it on the passenger seat of his truck. The mediator's office was in a rented suite in a corporate plaza. Glass doors, fake plants, the scent of disinfectant clinging to the air like pretense. Karen was already seated in the conference room when he arrived, her arms crossed, posture erect. Dressed not for comfort but for perception. Clean blazer, expensive shoes, a printed folder of her own resting in front of her like a shield. She looked at him when he entered but said nothing, and the mediator, a man trying too hard to appear neutral, gestured for them both to sit. The opening was civil. The mediator asked each of them to briefly describe the nature of the dispute. Karen went first. She spoke calmly, precisely, hitting every talking point she had rehearsed: concern for community resource equity, uncooperative behavior, her efforts to propose a sustainable model for water use, and the alleged escalation by Johnny through retaliatory runoff manipulation. She didn't outright accuse him of sabotage. She framed it as unintended environmental consequences. When it was Johnny's turn, he didn't counterpoint or unpack. He placed the photo on the table, slid it forward, and waited. The mediator picked it up first, blinked, then passed it to Karen. She froze. Her fingers stiffened slightly. She said nothing, but her eyes darkened, not with fear or guilt, but calculation. She knew what it meant, and more importantly, she knew what could happen if it were turned over to the wrong person. Johnny didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for anything. He simply said, "You crossed onto my land. You damaged my property. You interfered with my system and put chemicals into my soil. I've filed every report. I've answered every accusation. And I've done so while maintaining every legal right I have to protect my home. This is your only chance to walk away before you start something you can't talk your way out of." Karen didn't respond immediately. The mediator looked unsure whether to intervene. Finally, she adjusted her papers and said flatly, "I don't recognize that image as admissible, and I've already filed my own concerns with municipal affairs." Her voice held no apology, no acknowledgement, just forward momentum, as if facts were secondary to outcome. The mediator attempted to de-escalate, offering platitudes about mutual understanding and community harmony, but the table had already split. There would be no agreement. Johnny stood, thanked the mediator for his time, and left the folder behind, face up, knowing full well it would remain in the room after he was gone. He didn't need her confession. He only needed the mediator to see that this wasn't about shared ground or neighbors or drought. It was about violation. And he had shown plainly that he had endured enough of it. By the time he got home, the air had shifted again, not with noise, but with something else, subtle, pungent, wrong. The scent hit him as he opened the side gate, acrid, oily, not natural. He followed it instinctively toward the utility trench and found the cover to one of his outflow valves lifted and lying askew in the grass. The pipe beneath had been tampered with, tools used hastily, crudely. The pressure regulator had been loosened. The valve had been forced shut with a non-standard fitting, wedged in and cracked. It was an attempt to sabotage his flow, careless but targeted. A move not meant to succeed fully, but to disrupt enough to cause damage or trigger an overflow. He shut the main, checked the system integrity, and isolated the breach. No major harm done. But the message was clear. This wasn't over. Karen hadn't gotten what she wanted in that room, so now she was going to try one last desperate measure. Johnny spent the next 2 hours restoring the line, securing each joint with industrial-grade clamps and replacing the exposed segment with a steel-sheathed pipe that couldn't be cut without power tools. He didn't bother with the camera this time. He didn't need footage. He'd already filed the police report, the insurance claim, the county violations. The law would catch up in time. His job wasn't to chase her anymore. It was to make sure there was nothing left for her to reach. At dawn, he activated the emergency bypass he'd never used before, a vertical outflow designed to vent excess pressure into a sealed trench system below the shed, where it would filter through a gravel bed and into the natural runoff path down the hill. It was a fail-safe, built years ago in case of drought overload. Now it was repurposed as insulation, a circuit breaker for sabotage. Any future attempts to flood or choke his system would drain out silently, away from the house, away from the lines. She could try whatever she wanted. It would disappear before it touched him. And that was the final line, drawn not in law or threats or confrontation, but in architecture. Johnny's system no longer defended. It absorbed. It endured. Because sometimes victory doesn't look like retribution. It looks like a machine that runs, no matter what they do to it. There was no announcement, no sale sign, no movers, just absence. One morning, Karen's shutters remained closed longer than usual. Her porch empty, her driveway clear. By noon, her car was gone, and by sunset, so was she. Whatever catalyst had finally pushed her to leave, Johnny didn't know. Maybe it was the last inspection, the mounting documentation, or the quiet acknowledgement from a system that had grown tired of cleaning up after her manipulations. More likely, it was something simpler, realizing she no longer held sway over the place she once tried to rule by design and decree. Power, after all, required participation, and she'd finally lost her audience. The neighborhood didn't cheer when she disappeared. No one held a farewell gathering or asked where she went. They just resumed. Lawns were trimmed, fences repainted, holiday lights appeared, and the air felt clearer, not because of what was gone, but because of what no longer hovered. Johnny didn't alter his routine. He kept the same hours, checked the same gauges, cleaned the same filters. But something had shifted. There was no more anticipation of intrusion, no monitoring of sabotage. For the first time in months, he opened his gate without looking over his shoulder. The control systems remained, upgraded and sealed, not out of paranoia but out of principle. His property had become an organism of its own, resilient, self-contained, and unyielding to intrusion. Not because it needed to repel anything now, but because it had survived the need to. The tank pressure stayed consistent. No unexpected draws, no unexplained flow deviations. Silence returned, not as a void, but as a restoration. The land breathed again. So did he. It wasn't long before a new car appeared in Karen's driveway, an older hybrid with a dented rear bumper and a modest realty magnet on the side, a different kind of presence. A young couple moved in a week later, quiet, practical people who unpacked without fanfare, brought their trash bins in on time, and, most importantly, asked no immediate questions. Johnny observed them from a distance, not out of suspicion, but curiosity. They planted herbs instead of grass, built raised beds instead of installing new sprinklers, and waved without hesitation when they crossed paths. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a beginning grounded in mutual simplicity. One afternoon, the man, tall, soft-spoken, dressed in work boots and a frayed cap, approached Johnny at the gate and asked about the water table in the area. Not to challenge, not to inspect, just to understand. Johnny answered plainly. They talked, and that was all. The trench lines remained, buried and intact. The bypass valves stayed closed, but functional. Nothing was dismantled. Johnny had no interest in pretending nothing had happened. His land bore scars, subtle, infrastructural, and entirely earned. There was no need to hide them. They were part of the story now, part of the landscape. What mattered was that they were his, fully, unquestionably his, and that no one, no matter how loud or cunning, had taken them from him. One morning, weeks after Karen's departure, Johnny opened the workshop and found himself lingering at the control board longer than usual. The flow meters were steady, the backup gauges stable. There was no alert, no fluctuation, just a smooth, quiet function. He stared at the laminated documents pinned above, the county certification, the soil report, the image from the infrared camera. He didn't remove them. He didn't need reminders, but he left them in place. Not as trophies, but as truth. Because no matter how quietly the world moved on, the facts deserved space. And the quiet he had reclaimed deserved acknowledgement. Before locking up, he placed a new placard on the inside of the main panel. A simple metal plate, etched with deliberate care, affixed with brass screws. It didn't name names or declare victory. It read only, "Autonomy is not permission. It is earned." Then he turned off the lights, stepped into the yard, and let the air pass over him with no need to brace against it. No one else needed to know what had happened beneath that soil, through those pipes, or in the quiet decisions made behind drawn blinds. No one needed to retell it or record it. The system told the story now, in every unbroken line, every sealed valve, every calibrated pressure mark that held, night after night with no interference. And that, more than anything, was the ending Johnny had wanted. Not justice in the way people wrote about it. Not revenge and not vindication. Just the enduring, unshakable truth of something built right and left standing. Because sometimes the best kind of peace is the one no one notices.